to that. Go ahead and have a seat.
Hello, everyone. Happy Mother's Day. Hi, Mom. Happy Mother's Day to you. I love you. Thanks for watching, and thanks for all you do to keep Dad awake during these messages. I promise I will call you later today. Seriously, all these witnesses are here. I promise I'll call. We have 2 weeks remaining in this series on mental health. And this has been the hardest, most challenging series I've put together in a long time. And I have appreciated so much your encouragement, your affirmation, your appreciation of the fact that we're even talking about these matters. And I also appreciate your grace and patience as I have inadequately and incompletely and imperfectly articulated the messages in this series. I hope by now you've picked up on how I'm approaching this topic. So far in this series, I've tried to give us a theological framework that helps us think about and work through and respond to a variety of mental health challenges. And some of you have picked up on that I have used that phrase intentionally, mental health challenges, rather than speaking exclusively about mental illnesses or mental disorders. And I've done that because I wanted to cast as wide a net as possible to talk about all the many different mental issues or challenges or problems many of us will encounter over the course of a lifetime. I said early on in this series that if you have not experienced an identifiable mental health challenge yet, that likely just means one is coming. And for the final 2 weeks of this series, I do want to focus on some practical actions we can take to both maintain and also improve our mental health. There are a number of factors impacting our mental health, like genetics, chemical imbalances in the brain, traumatic experiences that are out of our control. But not all of the factors impacting our mental health are outside of our control. And today, I'm inviting you to spend some time thinking about what you think about. In Romans 12, the Apostle Paul says in verse 2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." In the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul unpacks his understanding of the gospel. And then beginning in chapter 12 here, he gets a bit more practical as he explains the difference the gospel can make in how we live and how we treat other people by changing the way we think. Think about God, think about the world, think about ourselves, and think about other people. And he calls this the renewal of our minds. This happens as our minds are renewed, and that our minds can be renewed. that we can change our patterns of thought is a truth validated by neuroscience. I told you at some point I was going to pretend to be a neuroscientist in this series. Now is that time. So our thoughts create chemical reactions in our brains. And as we repeat certain thoughts, those chemical reactions are repeated. And the more they're repeated, the more likely we are to form neural pathways in our brains, which makes it easier to think those thoughts, to the point that well-established neural pathways can lead to automatic or unconscious patterns of thought. And these neural pathways are not permanent, though, because our brains possess a trait called neuroplasticity, which simply means we can change our neural pathways. We can create new neural pathways by challenging old thoughts that created old pathways and introducing new thoughts and repeating those thoughts until new pathways are formed. In other words, we can retrain our brains by thinking about the way we think. And we can change the way we think by thinking about what we think. And the brain's neuroplasticity can work for us, but it can also work against us. We can use it to our advantage to make positive changes in our thought life, in our view of the world. Or we can ignore the brain's neuroplasticity at our own peril. Because our brain does not judge, when forming neural pathways, doesn't judge whether a thought is good or bad, helpful or harmful. It just forms the neural pathway depending on the repetition. So bad ideas, untrue thoughts, also known as lies, when repeated often enough, can form neural pathways in our brains that make it easier to believe that lie, that untrue thought. There is some research coming out of the field of communication that suggests one of the best ways to get people to believe a lie is to simply keep repeating it. Our politicians understand this all too well. Because the more we hear the same lie, the more it can start sounding true. If we hear it often enough, or if we hear enough people say it. And the reason for this is because we only use 10% of our brains, which is a lie. That's not true. You can look it up. It's a myth. Some people don't even use 10% of their brains. No, it's not true. Look it up. It's a myth, a lie. We only use 10% of our brains that many of us believe for one reason. We have heard it over and over again throughout our lives. And we've heard it from a variety of sources. And we can hear a lie often enough, or we can tell ourselves a lie often enough that it can start to sound true. We can believe it. And some of those lies can have a negative impact on our mental health. Now, please don't hear what I'm not saying. I am not saying, not even close to saying, that all of our mental health challenges are the result of stinking thinking and that we can reverse or overcome them simply by learning how to think more positively. I am not saying that. I am suggesting, however, that there are some lies that we can hear often enough and come to believe on a deeper unconscious level that can make us vulnerable to and exacerbate mental health challenges, or keep us stuck in a state of despair because they convince us that there's no real hope for change and there's nothing we can do to make a situation better. And those lies are toxic and destructive, and they are everywhere. Here are some examples of lies that we can tell ourselves and begin to believe. Therapists Psychologists sometimes call these distorted patterns of thought or cognitive distortions. One lie is that I must be perfect, or I must be successful, or I must be productive to be worthy of love. So I am not a human being, I'm a human doing, and I'm only lovable when I'm doing the perfect, the right, the good, the successful things. Or another lie is no one understands what I'm going through. No one. My pain, my struggle, my hurt is so unique. There's no one out there who could comfort or help me in my time of need. I am all alone in this. Or another lie is this world is a scary place, which can be true sometimes. But the lie part is, and I can't handle it. This world is scary and I can't handle what's coming at me. Or another lie is I must never show weakness. I must never demonstrate vulnerability. I must never admit that there's something in me that is hurting or that I need some help with. Or another lie, I'm better off alone. Because people, they betray me. They let me down, they drain me, they reject me. It's just better for me to be alone. And then finally, my presence in this world doesn't matter. And of course, these are just a few examples. But can you see how if any one of these lies were to become a pattern of thought, a habit of thought, how any one of these lies could set you up for a mental health challenge or make a mental health challenge worse? Can you see how, out of any one of these lies, we could begin to experience anxiety or depression or burnout or loneliness or despair? And can you also see how the wisdom found in Scripture challenges these lies with a more empowering truth rooted in the gospel? This is why the Scriptures, this is why the gospel story, this is why the lyrics we sing in our songs and the words we say in our prayers are resources for us in working through our mental health challenges, because they help replace the lies with some truth. They challenge the lies we can believe with something truer that we can build our lives on. Because you do not have to be perfect or successful or productive to be worthy of love. You're loved by God as you are because of who you are, God's beloved child, a human being created in the image of God. You can be far from perfect, far from perfect, and still be loved, embraced, and welcomed by God. As Paul says in Romans 5:8, while we were still sinners, while we were far from perfect, far from successful, far from being able to do anything good, Christ died for us. And there is someone who understands what you're going through. As the writer of Hebrews tells us in chapter 4, verse 15, you have a high priest interceding for you in heaven, that is Jesus Christ, who because of the time he spent living among us, understands and identifies with and can empathize with what it means to be human. Jesus understands the general and the specific struggles of being human, and you are not alone in your struggle. There is one who understands. And this world can be a scary place. Yes, it can be. But you're not walking through it alone, and you are not without resources to deal with whatever adversity is coming to you. As David says in Psalm 23, even when I walk through the darkest valley, or even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I need not fear any evil. Why? Because the Lord, my good shepherd, is with me every step of the way. And not just with me, but is providing me the comfort I need, is providing me the resources I need to keep going. Even when you're walking through a scary valley, you can handle it. You can keep going because you are not walking alone. And making ourselves vulnerable, showing weakness, provides an opportunity for the power and strength of God to be displayed in our lives. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, he says it's in my weakness or through my weakness that the power of Christ rests in me. When I am weak, that's when I'm strong, because that's when God is most at work, most active in my life. Showing weakness rather than hiding it makes room for God to do God's best work in you, especially the kind of work that other people can see in you. And it is not good for anyone to be alone. We were created for community, for connection, for companionship. As the teacher in Ecclesiastes says in chapter 4, two are better than one, because if one falls, the other can help the one up. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. We are better off together. It's not good to be alone. And finally, your presence does matter in this world. You matter. As Jesus says in Matthew 10, if God's eye is on the sparrow, God knows when the sparrow falls from the ground, then you can rest assured your Father in heaven is watching over and caring for you. You matter. Your life matters. God sees, knows, and cares for you. Now, the good news is we do not have to believe everything we think. I'll say it again. You don't have to believe everything you think. In fact, encourage each other with that word. Turn to a neighbor and say, hey, you don't have to believe everything you think. Say it to a neighbor. Say it out loud. Words help. You don't have to believe everything you think. That's good news. The challenging news is that changing the way you think is hard work and requires patience and persistence. Because first, you have to recognize and root out the lies you're believing. And then you have to replace those lies with an empowering truth. And then you have to repeat and reinforce that truth over and over and over again until you begin to form a new neural pathway or a new pattern of thought. And that is not easy to do, and it can be quite a challenge to do it all by yourself. It's not impossible. Some report that journaling can be super helpful in this area. You get all those thoughts in your head out on a paper or a page, and then you can read and evaluate them. But you also may need a counselor or a therapist or a coach to help you identify distorted patterns of thinking that are keeping you in a negative mental rut. This takes work. One of my big takeaways in putting this series together is how much work I need to do in this area of my life. And I'm benefiting greatly from the suggestions and exercises that come from cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT. Not CBD, that is a totally different thing. But you can Google CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, and you can find some wonderful summaries of distorted patterns of thinking and some exercises that you can begin to do as you journal or visit with someone else that can help you begin to recognize, replace, and repeat. So being able to think about what we think about is a gift from God. It's part of what it means to be created in the image of God. It's something unique to human beings. And it is an essential practice for those of us who want to grow in Christ-likeness. In 2 Corinthians 10, Paul shares what he understands to be one of the functions of his ministry. He says it like this, chapter 10, verse 5. He says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. Paul understands part of his job to be to demolish bad ideas before they take root in our brains, and to capture thoughts and submit them to the lordship of Christ. And this is serious business for Paul. I think it's why in many of his letters he comes across so direct, so bluntly, why he's so passionate about his argument, and why he's so quick to correct certain lines of thinking, because he understands the consequences of believing a lie. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 1 encourages beleaguered Christians with these words. He says, "Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Discipline yourselves. Prepare your minds for action." In the original language, he says something like, "Gird up the loins of your minds," which you can see why it gets translated, "prepare your minds for action." So when's the last time you've girded up your loins? How many girders not girdles, how many girders do we have here today? What does it even mean? Well, to gird up your loins was to pull up and tie off before a battle the loose tunics worn in the ancient world. So when someone girded up their loins, they were preparing for action, preparing for a battle by making sure they're not going to get tripped up. And something unnecessary is going to get in the way. So here Peter seems to be encouraging us then to prepare our minds in a disciplined way for combat. To get our thought life ready for the action of a battle by girding up the loins of our mind. And then later on in the letter, he returns to this theme and helps us see why this is so important. He says, "Be alert and of sober mind." Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Why gird up the loins of your mind? Why get your mind ready for combat? Why take every thought captive, make it obedient to Christ? Because we have an enemy seeking to devour us. We have an enemy seeking to do us harm. And our minds are the battleground. Our thoughts are contested territory. Now's a good time to remember that Jesus called our enemy, our adversary, the devil, the father of lies. The father of lies, the originator of lies. Because one of the ways our enemy tries to destroy everything good in God's world, including us, is by promoting and perpetuating lies. And part of cultivating good mental health, cultivating good spiritual health as well, is thinking about what we think about, so that we can recognize and then replace the lies. The lies the enemy tells us, but also the lies that get stuck in our head and we repeat them over and over and over. Lies that if we hear them enough, we will begin to believe them on a deep, unconscious level, to the harm of ourselves and maybe to the harm of others. This is serious business. There are consequences to not thinking about what we think about. So let's gird up the loins of our mind. And let's take all of our thoughts captive and make them obedient to Christ, who is and therefore always speaks and is always leading us into the truth. Yeah. May we think about what we think about, and may we build our lives on truth, not lies. Please stand and read this benediction with me. It comes from Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, Philippians 4, verse 8. Let's read this out loud together, and let's pay attention to that final phrase in this reading. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And the church said, Amen.